There's an exhaustion that sleep cannot cure, a fatigue that rest cannot heal, and a weariness that no amount of self-care can touch. It seeps into your bones like a persistent ache, follows you through your days like a shadow you cannot shake, and whispers to you in the quiet moments that something is fundamentally wrong with how you're living your life. You've probably felt it. That bone-deep tiredness that comes not from physical exertion, but from carrying the emotional weight of another person's world on your shoulders. You wake up thinking about their struggles, spend your days analyzing their moods, and fall asleep wondering what you could have done differently to ease their suffering. You've become an emotional archaeologist, digging through the layers of their past trauma, their childhood wounds, their unspoken fears, believing that if you could just understand deeply enough, you could somehow heal what's broken inside them. But here's what Carl Jung discovered through decades of studying the human psyche, and what modern neuroscience has confirmed through groundbreaking research. Your exhaustion isn't coming from caring too much. It's coming from a fundamental misunderstanding of where your responsibility ends and theirs begins. You're not tired because you're compassionate. You're tired because you're unconsciously trying to complete an impossible task that was never yours to complete in the first place. Jung called this phenomenon participation mystique, a psychological state where the boundaries between self and other become so blurred that you literally take on the emotional reality of another person as if it were your own. Dr. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people shows that approximately 20% of the population has nervous systems wired to absorb environmental stimuli more intensely, including the emotional states of others. When this natural sensitivity combines with unconscious psychological patterns, it creates a perfect storm of emotional exhaustion. What you're experiencing isn't weakness, and it's not a character flaw. It's the inevitable result of trying to solve an internal puzzle that belongs to someone else. Today we're going to explore why your deepest attempts at understanding and healing another person's pain might actually be preventing both of you from finding the peace you desperately seek. The codependent mind's hidden architecture. The human mind has an extraordinary capacity for connection and empathy, but it also has blind spots that can trap us in cycles of emotional servitude without our conscious awareness. When you find yourself obsessively trying to decode another person's inner world, you're not just being caring, you're unconsciously reenacting psychological patterns that were likely established long before you met this person. Dr. Pia Melody's groundbreaking work on codependency reveals that the compulsive need to understand and fix others often stems from early attachment disruptions. Children who grew up in households where they needed to monitor their caregivers' emotional states for safety develop what researchers call hypervigilant empathy, an exhausting state of constant emotional radar that continues into adulthood. Jung understood this dynamic through his concept of the wounded healer. He recognized that those most drawn to understanding others' pain often carry unresolved wounds from their own past. The unconscious logic goes something like this: if I can understand and heal their pain, perhaps I can finally understand and heal my own. But this creates a psychological trap. Instead of processing your own emotional material, you become perpetually focused outward, using another person's healing journey as a proxy for the inner work you're avoiding. Modern attachment theory, developed by researchers like Dr. Mary Ainsworth and Dr. John Bowlby, shows us that anxiously attached individuals often develop what's called protest behavior, persistent efforts to maintain connection through caretaking, problem-solving, and emotional management. When your nervous system learned early that love was conditional on your ability to anticipate and meet others' needs, trying to understand someone's inner pain becomes a survival strategy disguised as compassion. This creates what Jung called a complex, an autonomous cluster of thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that operates independently of conscious control. The rescuer complex drives you to believe that understanding equals healing, that insight equals transformation, and that if you could just find the right key, you could unlock the door to their emotional freedom. But complexes have their own agenda, and that agenda is often protection rather than healing. The exhaustion you feel isn't just emotional, it's neurological. Dr. Dan Siegel's research on interpersonal neurobiology shows that when we consistently focus on regulating someone else's emotional state, we dysregulate our own nervous system. Mirror neurons, designed to help us understand and connect with others, can become overactive in people who've learned to prioritize others' emotional states over their own. The projection screen of intimate relationships. Jung's most profound insight into human relationships was his understanding of projection, the unconscious process of seeing our own unresolved psychological material reflected in other people. When you find yourself intensely focused on understanding someone's inner pain, you're often encountering aspects of yourself that you haven't fully integrated or accepted. This doesn't mean you're imagining their struggles or that their pain isn't real. It means that the particular aspects of their suffering that capture your attention so completely are often the very aspects that resonate with unconscious patterns in your own psyche. The person whose emotional unavailability triggers your desperate need to understand them might be mirroring your own relationship with emotional intimacy. The partner whose anger fascinates and terrifies you might be reflecting your own relationship with healthy aggression. Dr. Harville Hendrix's research on intimate relationships reveals that we're unconsciously attracted to people who carry both the positive and negative traits of our primary caregivers. This isn't coincidence. It's the psyche's attempt to heal early relational wounds by recreating familiar dynamics and then trying to make them turn out differently. The problem is that when we're operating from this unconscious space, we're not actually relating to the person in front of us. We're relating to a complex mixture of our past experiences, unfulfilled needs, and projected expectations. Jung called this phenomenon the participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries become so permeable that you lose the ability to distinguish between your emotional experience and theirs. In this state, their depression becomes your responsibility to lift, their anxiety becomes your mission to soothe, their confusion becomes your puzzle to solve. You become what family systems therapist Dr. Murray Bowen called fused, so emotionally reactive to their internal state that you lose access to your own center. The cruel irony is that the more intensely you focus on understanding their pain, the less you're actually seeing them clearly. When you're projecting your own unresolved material onto someone, you're not witnessing their authentic experience. You're witnessing your own psychological content dressed up in their behavioral patterns. This creates a hall of mirrors effect, where neither of you can find solid ground for genuine intimacy. Research from Dr. Sue Johnson, founder of Emotionally Focused Therapy, shows that healthy, intimate relationships require what she calls secure attachment, the ability to remain emotionally connected while maintaining individual autonomy. When you're caught in the web of trying to understand someone's inner pain, you've abandoned your own emotional autonomy and entered what she describes as anxious pursuit, a pattern that actually pushes the other person further into their defensive patterns. The shadow side of compulsive understanding. Jung's concept of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject or remain unconscious of, reveals why our most caring impulses can sometimes cause the most harm. When you're compulsively trying to understand someone's inner pain, you may be unconsciously avoiding aspects of your own experience that feel too threatening to face directly. The shadow often contains what Jung called unlived life, parts of ourselves we've sacrificed in order to maintain our identity as the understanding one, the helper, the healer. If you've built your sense of worth around being the person who can handle other people's emotional complexity, then acknowledging your own needs, limits, or desires for reciprocity becomes psychologically dangerous. It threatens the entire structure of how you've learned to maintain connection and receive love. Dr. Carl Jung observed that what we resist most strongly in others often represents exactly what we need to integrate within ourselves. If their emotional withdrawal triggers your most intense efforts at understanding, you might need to explore your own relationship with healthy solitude and emotional boundaries. If their expressions of anger or frustration send you into analytical overdrive, you might need to examine your own relationship with healthy aggression and self-advocacy. The shadow also contains what Jung called the negative anima or negative animus, distorted expressions of our inner masculine and feminine energies. When the feminine quality of receptivity becomes compulsive emotional absorption, or when the masculine quality of understanding becomes aggressive analytical intrusion, we've moved into shadow territory. These distorted energies create exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. Instead of healing and connection, we create resistance and resentment. Modern trauma research by Dr. Peter Levine reveals that unresolved trauma often manifests as compulsive patterns of hypervigilance and caretaking. When your nervous system is stuck in survival mode, trying to understand and manage someone else's emotional state becomes a way of trying to create safety and predictability in an unpredictable world. But this strategy, while understandable, keeps both you and them trapped in patterns that prevent genuine healing and growth. The exhaustion you feel when constantly trying to understand someone's inner pain isn't just from the mental effort, it's from the enormous amount of energy required to maintain unconscious psychological defenses. When you're focused on their healing, you don't have to face your own unprocessed grief, your own unmet needs, your own fear of abandonment or engulfment. But these defended against experiences don't disappear. They consume life force from behind the scenes, creating the chronic fatigue that no amount of rest can cure. The neuroscience of emotional enmeshment. Recent advances in neuroscience have revolutionized our understanding of how emotional enmeshment affects the brain and nervous system. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory reveals that our autonomic nervous system is constantly scanning the environment for safety or threat, including the emotional states of people close to us. When you're in relationship with someone whose nervous system is chronically dysregulated, your own nervous system can become chronically activated in response. Mirror neurons, discovered by researchers like Dr. Marco Rizzolatti, were designed to help us understand and empathize with others through neural mimicry. But in people with a history of developmental trauma or insecure attachment, these systems can become hyperactive, creating what Dr. Dan Siegel calls emotional contagion, the unconscious absorption of others' emotional states as if they were your own. Dr. Deb Dana's work on polyvagal-informed therapy shows that when your nervous system is constantly responding to someone else's dysregulation, you lose access to your own social engagement system, the neural circuitry that allows for authentic connection, clear communication, and emotional resilience. Instead, you become trapped in what she calls sympathetic mobilization, a state of chronic anxiety and hypervigilance that manifests as the compulsive need to understand, analyze, and fix. Brain imaging studies by Dr. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA reveal that the effort to understand and regulate someone else's emotions activates the same neural networks involved in physical pain. When you're chronically focused on decoding someone's inner world, your brain literally experiences this as a form of suffering. The anterior cingulate cortex, which processes both physical and emotional pain, becomes chronically activated, creating the sensation of carrying a heavy weight that you can never set down. Research by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett on emotional granularity shows that people who are most skilled at identifying and articulating their own emotional experiences have better emotional regulation and more satisfying relationships. But when you're chronically focused on understanding someone else's emotional world, you often lose touch with the nuanced landscape of your own inner experience. Your emotional vocabulary becomes externally focused, and you gradually lose the ability to recognize and respond to your own needs and boundaries. The impossible task of healing others. Jung understood something that most people miss. The desire to heal another person often contains a fundamental misunderstanding of how psychological healing actually works. Healing isn't something that happens to someone. It's something that happens through someone's conscious engagement with their own experience. When you try to understand someone's inner pain deeply enough to heal it, you're attempting to do their inner work for them, which is not only impossible, but often counterproductive. Dr. Gabor Mate's research on addiction and trauma reveals that healing requires what he calls conscious suffering, the willingness to feel and process one's own pain rather than avoiding it through external focus or substances. When you become the external focus for someone else's pain avoidance, you're actually enabling their disconnection from their own healing process. Your understanding, no matter how deep or accurate, cannot substitute for their own inner work. Jung's process of individuation, the journey towards psychological wholeness, is inherently individual. It cannot be outsourced, delegated, or completed by another person, no matter how loving or insightful. When you exhaust yourself trying to understand someone's inner pain, you're often unconsciously trying to shortcut this process, to find a way around the difficult work of sitting with discomfort and allowing natural healing processes to unfold. Family systems theory, developed by Dr. Murray Bowen, reveals that when one person in a relationship system becomes overly focused on another's problems, it actually increases that person's tendency toward dysfunction. This happens because taking responsibility for someone else's emotional state prevents them from experiencing the natural consequences of their choices and patterns. Without these consequences, there's no internal pressure for growth or change. Dr. Melody Beattie's research on codependency shows that the helper's exhaustion often signals that they've crossed the line from supportive love into enabling dysfunction. When your understanding becomes compulsive, when their pain becomes your emergency, when their healing becomes your responsibility, you've entered territory that serves neither of you. The person you're trying to help remains stuck because they don't have to develop their own emotional resources, and you remain exhausted because you're attempting an impossible task. The psychology of emotional martyrdom. Jung observed that some of the most destructive patterns in human relationships are driven by what appears to be the most noble motivations. The person who exhausts themselves trying to understand and heal others' pain often sees themselves as selfless, caring, and spiritually advanced. But beneath this conscious identity often lies what Jung called the savior complex, an unconscious pattern that uses others' suffering as a way to avoid facing one's own psychological work. Dr. Alice Miller's groundbreaking work on narcissistic injury reveals that children who grew up having to be emotionally precocious, understanding and managing adults' emotional states, often develop what she calls false self structures. The false self becomes skilled at reading and responding to others' needs, while remaining disconnected from its own authentic experience. In adulthood, this manifests as the compulsive need to understand and fix others as a way of maintaining psychological coherence. The emotional martyr receives what psychologists call secondary gains from their exhausting focus on others' pain. These gains might include feeling needed and important, avoiding intimacy by staying in the helper role, maintaining control through caretaking, or receiving social recognition for being so caring and understanding. But these secondary gains come at an enormous cost: the gradual erosion of authentic selfhood and the capacity for genuine intimacy. Research by Dr. Kenneth Adams on enmeshed relationships shows that emotional martyrdom often stems from what he calls covert incest, childhood experiences where a child becomes a parent's emotional confidant or support system. These children learn that their value depends on their ability to understand and manage adult emotional complexity. In adult relationships, they unconsciously recreate this dynamic, becoming exhausted by trying to be someone's emotional savior. Jung's concept of enantiodromia, the tendency of psychological patterns to flip into their opposites, reveals the shadow side of compulsive understanding. The person who exhausts themselves trying to heal others often harbors unconscious resentment, control issues, and a secret sense of superiority. "Look how much I care," the unconscious whispers. "Look how hard I try to understand," while they remain unconscious and selfish. In the illusion of emotional control. One of the most seductive aspects of trying to understand someone's inner pain is the illusion that understanding equals influence, that insight equals control. If you could just find the right words, ask the right questions, or demonstrate the right level of empathy, surely they would heal, grow, and become the person you know they could be. But this belief system reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how human psychology actually works. Jung understood that each person's psyche has its own wisdom, its own timing, and its own pathway toward integration. When you exhaust yourself trying to understand someone's inner pain, you're often unconsciously trying to override their natural psychological processes with your own agenda for their healing. This creates resistance rather than flow, defensiveness rather than openness, and often causes the very problems you're trying to solve. Dr. William Miller's research on motivational interviewing reveals that people change when they discover their own reasons for changing, not when someone else understands their pain deeply enough to convince them to change. When you become overly invested in understanding someone's inner world, you often inadvertently communicate that their current way of being is unacceptable, which triggers natural psychological defenses and makes genuine change less likely. The exhaustion you feel often comes from swimming against the current of natural psychological processes. Jung observed that the psyche has its own self-regulating capacity, what he called the transcendent function, that creates healing and growth when it's not interfered with by well-meaning but misguided intervention. When you try too hard to understand and fix someone's inner pain, you often disrupt these natural processes rather than supporting them. Modern attachment research shows that secure relationships are characterized by what Dr. Sue Johnson calls accessibility, responsiveness, and engagement, but not by taking responsibility for each other's emotional states or healing processes. When you cross the line from supportive presence into compulsive understanding, you've moved from secure attachment into anxious attachment, which creates exactly the opposite of what you're hoping to achieve. The path to conscious boundaries. Jung's path toward psychological health requires what he called differentiation, the ability to remain emotionally connected to others while maintaining clear internal boundaries. This doesn't mean becoming cold or uncaring. It means developing the capacity to witness someone's pain without absorbing it, to offer support without taking responsibility, and to love without losing yourself. The first step in this process is developing what mindfulness teacher Tara Brach calls radical acceptance of your own limitations. You cannot heal another person's pain, no matter how deeply you understand it. You cannot love someone into wholeness, no matter how pure your intentions. You cannot save someone from their own psychological journey, no matter how much it hurts to watch them struggle. This acceptance isn't resignation, it's liberation. When you release the impossible task of healing others, you free up enormous amounts of energy that can be directed toward your own growth, creativity, and authentic contribution to the world. You also create space for genuine intimacy, because you're no longer relating to others through the filter of your need to fix them. Dr. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability shows that healthy relationships require what she calls empathic boundaries, the ability to feel with someone without feeling for them, to offer compassion without taking on their emotional burden. This requires developing your own emotional regulation skills, your own capacity to tolerate discomfort, and your own sense of worth that doesn't depend on being needed by others. Jung's practice of active imagination can be particularly helpful in this process. Instead of trying to understand someone else's inner world, you can explore your own psychological material through dialogue with different aspects of your psyche. This inner work often reveals that your compulsive focus on others is actually an avoidance of your own unprocessed emotions, unmet needs, or unlived potential. The wisdom of stepping back. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop trying so hard to understand their pain. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent or abandoning them in their suffering. It means trusting their own capacity for growth and healing, even when, especially when, you can't see evidence of that capacity in their current behavior. Jung observed that growth often happens through what he called the dark night of the soul, periods of confusion, pain, and apparent regression that are actually necessary stages in the individuation process. When you try too hard to rescue someone from these difficult passages, you may actually interfere with their natural development and rob them of the strength that comes from working through challenges independently. Dr. Rachel Rieman's work with medical professionals reveals that healing relationships are characterized by holy curiosity rather than compulsive understanding. Holy curiosity allows space for mystery, for not knowing, for trusting processes that you cannot fully comprehend or control. This spacious awareness often creates more healing than all your efforts at analysis and intervention combined. The exhaustion you've been carrying can begin to lift when you practice what Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls staying with yourself. Instead of abandoning your own experience to dive into someone else's psychological world, you can learn to remain present with your own emotions, needs, and boundaries. This internal presence often communicates more healing than any amount of external understanding. Research by Dr. Kristin Neff on self-compassion shows that people who practice treating themselves with kindness and understanding are actually more capable of offering authentic support to others. When you're not depleting yourself through compulsive caretaking, you have genuine resources to offer, presence, wisdom, and love that flows from fullness rather than emptiness. Reclaiming your life force. Jung believed that each person has a finite amount of psychic energy, and how we invest that energy determines the quality and direction of our lives. When you chronically exhaust yourself trying to understand someone else's inner pain, you're investing your most precious resource in an endeavor that belongs to them, not you. This misallocation of energy keeps you from developing your own potential, pursuing your own dreams, and contributing your unique gifts to the world. Dr. Gay Hendricks' work on what he calls the zone of genius reveals that each person has specific areas where their natural talents and passion intersect with what the world needs. When you're caught in cycles of compulsive understanding and emotional caretaking, you're operating in what he calls the zone of incompetence, trying to do something that isn't yours to do and that you cannot actually accomplish, no matter how hard you try. Reclaiming your life force requires what Jung called withdrawing projections, recognizing when you're trying to live someone else's life instead of your own. This process often involves grief, because letting go of the fantasy that you can heal others means accepting your own powerlessness in some situations. But this grief opens the door to authentic power, the ability to influence your own experience and offer genuine gifts from your own unique nature. The energy that's been tied up in understanding others' pain can be redirected toward developing your own emotional intelligence, pursuing your own creative expressions, or building relationships based on mutual growth rather than caretaking patterns. As you reclaim this energy, you often discover interests, talents, and possibilities that were dormant while you were focused elsewhere. Jung's concept of active imagination can help you dialogue with the parts of yourself that have been neglected while you were busy trying to heal others. What dreams have you postponed? What creative expressions have been waiting for your attention? What aspects of your own personality need development and integration? These questions can guide you back toward your own life path. The transformation of exhaustion into wisdom. The bone-deep tiredness you've been carrying contains important information about the sustainability of your current approach to relationships and life. Jung saw symptoms not as problems to be eliminated, but as messengers pointing toward necessary adjustments in how we're living. Your exhaustion is telling you that something fundamental needs to change. This change doesn't require you to become selfish or uncaring. It requires you to develop what Dr. Dan Siegel calls mindsight, the ability to see your own mental processes clearly and make conscious choices about where to focus your attention and energy. When you can witness your compulsive patterns without being controlled by them, you create space for more skillful responses. The wisdom that emerges from transforming exhaustion isn't just personal. It becomes a gift you can offer to others who are caught in similar patterns. As you learn to love without losing yourself, to care without controlling, to support without saving, you model a different way of being in relationship. This modeling often communicates more effectively than any amount of advice or understanding. Jung believed that the individuation process, the journey toward becoming who you truly are, is not a selfish pursuit, but a contribution to the collective healing of humanity. When you stop exhausting yourself through misguided attempts to heal others, and instead focus on your own growth and authentic expression, you become a more powerful force for positive change in the world. The relationships in your life will transform as you establish healthier boundaries and more authentic ways of connecting. Some relationships may end if they were based primarily on caretaking dynamics, but the relationships that remain, and the new ones that form, will be based on genuine mutual respect and shared growth rather than unconscious neediness and enabling patterns. Your life can become an expression of your authentic nature rather than a reaction to others' unhealed wounds. The creativity, passion, and vitality that have been trapped in cycles of compulsive understanding can be liberated and directed toward purposes that truly matter to you. This isn't abandonment of others. It's the foundation for offering your real gifts to the world. Jung understood that the most profound healing happens not through understanding someone else's pain, but through becoming whole yourself. As you reclaim your energy, establish healthy boundaries, and focus on your own growth, you create the conditions for relationships based on love rather than need, presence rather than projection, and authentic connection rather than exhausting entanglement. The tiredness you've been carrying can transform into vitality. The compulsive understanding can evolve into spacious wisdom. The impossible task of healing others can give way to the possible and deeply fulfilling work of becoming fully yourself. This is not just recovery from codependent patterns, it's awakening to your own life, your own path, and your own contribution to the healing of the world.